Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. My name is Hermes, and I will be your technical facilitator today to ensure that you have a smooth experience with Zoom. You are at the session titled Welcome and Highlights of Day 2, which will be followed immediately by the plenary panel on science and assessment. We will begin in just a moment here, but before we get started, we would like to let you know that this meeting will be recorded for documentation purposes. The chat box is available in case you have any perspectives you'd like to share, or if you need to reach out to me for technical assistance. Japanese language simultaneous interpretation is available during this session. The feature has already been activated and is available now. To listen in the Japanese language, please click Interpretation at the menu at the bottom of your screen and select Japanese. For those of you just joining us, welcome. You are at the session titled Welcome and Highlights from Day 2, which will be followed immediately by the plenary session on science and assessment. I think we are now ready to get started, so I will pass the floor to Mozaharul Alam, head of the APAN Secretariat and Regional Climate Change Coordinator at the United Nations Environment Program, Asia and the Pacific Office. Mozaharul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hermes. Dear participants, welcome to the third day of the 7th Asia Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Hope you had a good rest, and many of you may have also attended the special event organized by the Global Adaptation Network this morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this session on highlights of the Day 2. Highlights of the Day 2 will be presented by Desiree of Tofu Creative. She will be taking us through her artwork, covering the plenary session on the planning and processes that we have organized yesterday, along with 4 technical sessions organized by Asian Development Bank, Stockholm Environment Institute and ICIMOD, United Nations Development Program, and UNEP and IUCN. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Desiree. Over to you.
Thank you, Babu, and I hope everyone can see our Miro board. So this is where we put all our graphic recordings. And in case you missed it, we captured yesterday's events through these live illustrations. Shout out to my teammates, Nitya, Kiko, and Stephanie, who've been working very hard to make all of this happen. I'd just like to update that all the visual summaries for day 1 are available, including the nature-based resilience and inclusive resilience grid. Okay, so I will be walking you through this journey, and then let's begin. For the plenary, we had these key messages on how resilience is a journey and we must put people front and center. And we must also have planning synergies. We must mainstream climate change in planning and budgeting. We must think beyond short-term projects and how the world can learn from what we do in Asia. And from the panel, we had these questions on how do we connect local actions to global funding? How do we mainstream resilience into planning? And how can we support risk-informed planning? And finally, some bright spots that were mentioned was that financial access of local governments is improving, and of course, the engagement and energy of young people. Moving on to our inclusive resilience stream, the main messages were first, addressing the root causes of vulnerability for transformative change, and how everyone is impacted by climate change differently. This was mentioned by all the panelists, and we have to recognize the intersections in order to make strategic interventions. And third, how we must all advocate for inclusion. And as for economic resilience, there were these 3 key answers from how do we overcome the tragedy of the horizon. And first is similar to the main plenary message, which was move beyond short-term planning. Second is to break silos and promote coordinated approaches towards adaptation planning. And third, how jobs and skills should be at the center of adaptation planning. And next, we have the communities and local resilience, where we heard the message adaptation is not a one time effort, but an ongoing cycle. And then from the keynote, we had how we must respond, recover, redesign, and how we must all work together, and how we need to sail just one boat. And then from the country experiences, we heard about the challenges of data availability, limited capacities, and also the lack of future scenarios modeling. And there was this call for a need for more collaborative efforts on finance. And lastly, for the nature-based resilience, integrating ecosystems-based adaptation is key in national adaptation plans, but it's not the only venue. We also have the NDCs. Next, we must embed health and biodiversity concerns in policy development processes. And country experiences talked about um, overcoming the hurdles of financial access, lack of understanding, and policies that don't consider uh, EBAs. And of course, we ended by saying that capacity development and building is key. Okay, that wraps up our day 2. Thank you, everyone. And we're looking forward to today's events on science and assessment. Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure drawing the big picture with all of you. Over to you, Babu.
Thank you, Desiree, for taking us through very good and nice artwork. And when you just mentioned about that we are on the same boat, it reminded me one of the COP that the government of Fiji hosted, and they brought it's called the canoe in the Pacific Island countries. And this is exactly one of the messages that they have presented, that we are on the same boat in the context of climate change, and we need to solve the problem together. Either we survive together or we drown together. So I think this is one of the things that I'd like to mention. But thank you very much for presenting the artwork. Dear participants, all this artwork that Desiree presented will be also available in the Hubilu, the platform that we are using for the APAN, the forum. I also would like to mention that we are presenting daily the summary and the key messages through the IISD, the reporting services. And that is also available through the IISD, the reporting service portal, as well as available through the APAN, the portal, as well as the Hubilo, the conference, the portal. So please visit and get more information about the day summary, as well as the discussion happening using the platform. So with that, I also would like to mention to the participants that we are also using another channel called Moral. So please go and visit that channel, present your action, what we call my action to climate change, what I'm going to do to address the climate change, specifically building the resilience for this Asia Pacific region. And I'd like to just mention one thing which I mentioned earlier as well. If we look into the Asia Pacific, the resilience for all cannot be built without addressing and building the resilience for the Asia Pacific region, which is home of about 60% of the world population and about 35% of the global GDP in terms of its contribution. So this region is very, very important in building the resilience. and my action is equally important. So please come up with what you can do, what your organization can do, addressing the climate change, building the resilience for Asia and the Pacific. With that note, we'll be moving very soon to the plenary session, which will be on the climate science and the assessment. And the climate science assessment plenary will be starting in about 2 to 3 minutes. And I would like to introduce the Veronica, who will be moderating the climate science and the plenary session. And Veronica has more than 20 years experiences as a journalist and a communicator. She played a key role in CNN, the BBC, the World News, the BBC World Services, as well as Al Jazeera English, as well as responding to the breaking news, etc. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Veronica, who will be moderating the plenary session on climate science, which will begin probably in a minute or two. Over to you, Veronica.
Hello, Babu. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, indeed. People may be aware of my work previously with all those international news channels, but I do want to say that it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be participating in something like this, because it's through conferences like this that we can really engage substantively with the kind of decisions that are being made that will shape the future for all of us, for the entire world. This last year, during which we've suffered under the pandemic of the coronavirus or COVID-19, has shown just how intertwined climate change, biodiversity, and public health are. So I think that this is a wake-up call that has drawn attention to how important discussions like the one we're having is for the moment. We're going to start in a minute, and I'll introduce our panelists at that time. But for now, I just want to give you a summary of the Inclusive Resilience Outlook that has been prepared as a briefing, just to let you know that climate change and disasters, of course, affect people differently depending on their socioeconomic status, race or ethnicity, abilities, age, gender and sexuality, access to resources, and decision-making power. Now, the Asia-Pacific region has a particularly high exposure to climate hazards, and that's made resilience building an urgent priority. However, if resilience building efforts fail to include marginalized people and recognize their differentiated vulnerabilities, they could leave a large share of the population in danger. This is a particular concern as the pandemic has intensified competition for limited resources and, of course, implications for current and future actions to build resilience to climate risks. Now, I believe that we are ready to start. Or we have several, apparently we have to wait just a couple more minutes just to keep going for a little bit. For now, I think we can begin. We have some attendees in there. Thanks very much, everyone. Hello. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Veronica Pedrosa, and I will be your host and moderator for the next hour. It's a pleasure and privilege to join you here at the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum on the overarching theme of enabling resilience for all, the critical decade to scale up action. In the next 60 minutes, our plenary discussion is on science and assessment, the third of 5 enablers through which resilience may be enhanced to deliver an inclusive, resilient society, the resilience of economic sectors, nature-based resilience, and resilience of local communities against the adverse impacts of climate change. We will engage experts to examine available knowledge of climate science, its application by different actors at different levels, and limitations as well to support decision-making. It aims to bring examples of the use of climate science and its application by government, the private sector, and funding agencies for designing adaptation actions supported by science. I also want to let you know that we are to hear from one of the lead authors of the UNEP synthesis report, Making Peace with Nature, Sir Bob Watson. Just to remind you that that report communicates how climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution can be tackled jointly within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. And that report serves to translate the current state of scientific knowledge into crisp, clear, and digestible facts-based messages that the world can relate to and follow up on. So it'll be great to hear from him later. First, though, let's hear from our keynote speaker, who will set out the main issues. May I introduce Anand Patwardhan. He's a professor of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. He's worked extensively in the area of climate policy at the national and multilateral level, focusing on mitigation and adaptation responses to climate change and the assessment of vulnerability and adaptation. He has also worked on broader issues of science, technology, and innovation policy, including the diffusion and adoption of clean technology. Thank you very much, and over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Many thanks to the APAN Secretariat for organizing this excellent gathering, and to Veronica for the kind introduction. It is indeed a pleasure to be at this session, and really a privilege to set the stage for what promises to be a really exciting and enriching panel discussion to follow. I believe it's particularly appropriate that this 7th APAN Forum focuses on the enablers of action, and especially on science and assessment. Indeed, the report of the Global Commission on Adaptation, with which I had the privilege of being associated, called for 3 revolutions in understanding, planning, and finance, with the revolution in understanding as the starting point. Key to this revolution was actually a rather simple idea: make risk visible and act on it. Making risk visible is not only about who or what is at risk: lives, livelihoods, ecosystems, infrastructure, the built environment, but also the why, the reasons why they are at risk. And these reasons often have to do with development deficits and policy deficits, which distribute the burden of climate impacts quite unfairly. In practice, making risk visible turns out to be not so simple, as it not only requires understanding of climate hazards, but also the exposure of people, societies, and economies to those hazards, and their ability to respond. And we have to then connect that assessment of climate risk to the wide range of public and private decisions where climate change matters. The generation and use of actionable information remains a challenge. But making risk visible is only the first half of the idea. Ultimately, we need to manage the risk and act on it. Managing risk requires a shift in focus towards solutions, and this shift is critically needed. Many scientific assessment processes, whether the IPCC or GEO, have done really an extraordinary job in building understanding of the problem and establishing its existence, significance, and criticality really beyond any reasonable doubt. And yet we find that actions, whether adaptation or mitigation, are often not happening at the scale and urgency needed. The search for solutions needs to happen where the risks are being manifested, and where those on the front lines, smallholder farmers, the informal poor in cities, are already responding because they have no other choice. And that is my first message. Innovations and solutions for adaptation are as likely to come from the bottom up and from those on the front lines as they are likely to come from the labs of formal science. And this then is the challenge. How do we link the two? How do we link the enterprise of formal science with the distributed, unorganized, and context-specific space of informal innovation? How do we ensure that when decisions are made, they're informed by robust evidence for what works and what does not? Which therefore brings me to my second point, which is that successfully addressing the issues of where solutions lie and what they are requires us to change the how our research enterprise is structured. Specifically, I would argue that we need to move towards a research enterprise that is transdisciplinary, that is user-centered and solutions-focused, or what we might refer to as action research, that takes the inside out from the lab to the field and brings the outside in, where the user becomes an integral part of the research effort. And this is challenging because we immediately run up against barriers and constraints, systemic barriers that often contribute to the current status quo. And they include, for example, factors like funding. There's just significant underinvestment in action-oriented and applied research. Research is often not appropriately targeted. It's decoupled from the needs of the most vulnerable. Research is often siloed. Misaligned incentives prevent multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research that is needed. There's often a lack of coherence. There's low capacity, and there's insufficient investment in learning. Learning is important, but it's not costless and is not easy. And it takes a conscious effort from a variety of organizations to make sure that it happens. Ladies and gentlemen, it's obvious that there's no one actor or even one type of actor that has the power to make the systemic changes necessary to overcome these conditions. This is a classic wicked problem, and it will require a coordinated effort by many different types of actors: researchers, funding agencies, policymakers, and the private sector and civil society. This is a huge task. One practical way forward might be to agree on a set of principles that could inform our research projects and programs to ensure that research adopts a wider lens, that is collaborative and builds capacity, that is inclusive, where we have appropriate metrics for understanding impact, that is flexible and iterative, that's coordinated, and that empowers actors by leaving a legacy, and that focuses on long-term outcomes. Agreeing to a set of principles is one step, but realizing the systemic changes necessary is another step entirely. But there are encouraging efforts. There are some excellent examples in the Asia Pacific region, but let me highlight one from Africa. Fractal, Future Resilience for African Cities and Lands, is an effort whose long-term goal is to increase the climate resilience of Southern African cities by supporting decision-making processes to include climate knowledge. Some of the things that Fractal has done differently highlight the importance of the principles I outlined. The project included researchers, engineers, government representatives, NGOs, and other stakeholders in learning processes to better understand risks that will likely be exacerbated by climate change. These learning processes resulted in the co-production of relevant climate knowledge and the formulation of resilient development pathways. Fractal challenged the information and communication deficit framing, the idea that scientific information is not yet adequate or certain enough to inform decisions, focusing on connecting city actors to existing science through in-depth transdisciplinary research. It embedded researchers in city councils and regular in-city learning labs to support social learning involving a variety of stakeholders. It involved city actors in interrogating how climate change information is constructed, including decisions on assumptions, certainty, and communication. Examples like Fractal are heartening. They show us that it is indeed possible to execute a different kind of research enterprise and make a difference. Our big challenge now is to scale up so that these examples are not rare, but ubiquitous. Even in the scaling up process, there are encouraging efforts underway. One that I'm particularly pleased to be a part of is a brand new global initiative called the Adaptation Research Alliance, which is aimed at scaling up and catalyzing investment in applied action research. Through the ARA, we are seeking to create a coalition across the research and action landscape, bringing together traditional research funders and action funders, and creating a global platform that can deliver resources through new programs and support better planning and cooperation. The ARA is a part of the UK COP26 presidency's efforts on adaptation, and I'm very pleased that UNEP has been a strong supporter of this alliance, and we hope to officially launch the ARA at COP26. I invite you all to join us. In concluding, I believe that this plenary meeting on science and assessment is really a critical step in our efforts to chart a path towards a research enterprise for action. and that is organized and works very differently than what we are used to now. I'm looking forward to a very productive discussion. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much indeed to you, Professor Patwardhan. Now, a video performance from Grupo Jobel, his resilience drop. How brilliant. What a great piece with which to continue our discussion. It really sets things up, doesn't it, in a very accessible way. This discussion is one in which we'll review examples of the supportive role of climate science in long-term adaptation planning and in making technology choices for adaptation. The discussion aims to bring out some key messages and recommendations on key actions required in the area of climate science and risk analysis to support and scale up adaptation actions and enable resilience for all. To introduce our first panelist now, Nicola Willey is the UK Regional Director, Southeast Asia Science and Innovation. She's responsible for promoting science and innovation cooperation between the UK and countries in Southeast Asia. Before moving to Singapore, Nicola spent 3.5 years in Beijing as head of the UK Foreign Office's China Climate Change and Energy Network. Thanks very much indeed. Ms. Willey, what have been examples that you've come across where climate science has been used to inform policy?
Well, first of all, let me thank you very much for the opportunity to speak and for the invitation to be on the panel today. It's a real privilege to participate in this discussion and to sit, albeit virtually, alongside my fellow panelists today and to be able to contribute. So thank you so much for the invitation and to the organisers. So as you kindly introduced me, I work for the UK government, helping to support joint science between the UK and our partners, particularly in the Southeast Asia region. And a good chunk of that is around excellent science on climate change, both mitigation, but also resilience and adaptation. And we take a partnerships-based approach to that, in that the UK government works with our funding partners and governments in the region to support science in this area. So I wanted, if I may, to flag 2 examples, which I think hopefully might be food for thought for our discussion. The first is looking at severe weather in Southeast Asia, and I listened carefully to the summary of the discussions that have taken place so far, and the discussion around the impacts of extreme weather on economic development, on welfare and on well-being, and the need for improved forecasting of high impact weather, improved interpretation of those forecasts, and the delivery of better advice and guidance from forecasters to disaster managers and vulnerable communities, the people who will use that information. And so we're supporting a program called WCSSP, the Weather and Climate Science for Services Partnership, which looks at tackling these things. It looks firstly at global scale science and modeling, then regional scale science and modeling, and then science to forecasting. And one of the main aims of the program is to develop the capacity in the region to issue timely and accurate warnings of high impact weather. So some of the work done so far through this partnership includes, for example, science on seasonal forecasts of tropical cyclones, identifying the causes of extreme rainfall events in the region, and evaluation of impact-based forecasting. So to pick up that final point, there's a lot of work in hand on the development of impact-based forecasting and improving the utility of warnings so that warnings are targeted and communicated in a way that enables and motivates people to respond to them, so that they are usable and targeted and delivered in a way which people respond to. So the program gives all of our partners an opportunity to share how they disseminate extreme weather information. There's really interesting best practice about how that's done. Warnings for cross-country learning. We're looking at things like visualization of large data sets. So again, scientific information is presented in a way that is usable and understandable, and brings together a lot of data into a set that people can use and engage with. And its aim of the entire program is to strengthen the resilience of vulnerable communities to weather and climate variability and climate change through strong and mutually beneficial partnerships. So I offer that as an example. Do I have time to touch on one more example, or would you like to move on to another panelist?
Well, if you can be very quick, that's an extremely good example, though. Of course, you know, I come from the Philippines originally, and I covered the situation during Haiyan and Yolanda, yes. And you know, so this sort of intersection between science and communication seems to me absolutely urgent. So I mean, if you can be really quick, that would be great.
I'll be very quick. So it's the second program I wanted to talk about. It's new research in the region looking at increasing resilience to hydrometeorological hazards, and there's been a great deal of discussion around increasing resilience to flooding, droughts, landslides, storm surges, and other hazards which many of us are very familiar with. As we all know, these hazards pose a threat to lives, and they impact livelihoods in all sorts of ways by damaging transport links or power supplies or agricultural land, often impacting the most vulnerable, as we have already heard. And through these projects, we aim to bring together scientists from the UK with their partners in the region to look at key hydrometeorological hazards in countries around the region, critically to look at multi-hazards, how hazards intersect, and then how these things intersect with socioeconomic behaviour and social science. So again, trying to work between the disciplines and trying to work in a focused way at some of the key issues and challenges in the region. So that's my sort of start of 10. Looking forward to hearing from others.
Thanks very much indeed, Ms. Willie. That was really valuable. And thank you for being sensitive about the time restrictions that we're all under in this conference.
Thank you.
So I'd like to introduce our next speaker, if I may. Dr. Nambi Appadurai currently serves as the director of the Climate Resilience Practice of the World Resources Institute, or WRI India. He has about 20 years of experience in the development sector, and Dr. Appudurai's overarching research interests intersect the areas of climate risk management, adaptation, and environmental policy, as well as institutional development and governance. Thanks very much indeed. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Veronica. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. At the outside, I would like to thank APAN for inviting me and for this opportunity. I mean, enough has been said about the role and importance of climate science. Simply put, useful and reliable information firmly grounded on best science would help decision makers, one, to understand the vulnerabilities as a starting point, and then to take appropriate adaptation actions. Today, science-driven risk assessments has become institutionalized as common practice in governments, businesses, and private sector, and civil society organizations to guide climate actions. Yet there are certain challenges. The capacity to generate, understand, and respond to climate science is low. To me, addressing this problem itself is a good adaptation measure, response. Now, moving on to the example, I come from India, and I'll pick an example from the agriculture sector. Agriculture is, Indian economy is driven by agriculture, and it is a very diverse country, as you all know. It's with varied geography. It has about 20 major agroecological zones, which is subdivided into 60 sub-regional agroecological zones, and then with 121 agroclimatic zones. So you could see the complexity of the geography. The country's climate is largely influenced by Indian monsoon. India's economy is predominantly monsoon dependent. As someone put it, the real finance minister of India is the monsoon, India's monsoon. One of the examples I would like to touch upon is the National Mission on Agriculture, which is one of the key missions under the National Action Plan on Climate Change. A significant initiative considered under the Agriculture Mission is the National Initiative on Climate Resilient Agriculture, what is in short form, it's called as NICRA. The program aims to enhance resilience of Indian agriculture to climate change and climate vulnerability through strategic research and technology demonstration. NICRA has a threefold objective, as I mentioned, to undertake strategic and applied research in climate change adaptation and mitigation, and two, to validate some of the technologies and demonstrate the capabilities, and also to strengthen the capacity of scientists, farmers, and other stakeholders in climate resilient agriculture. One of the major contributions of the initiative of NICRA is the National Agriculture Vulnerability to Climate Change Atlas. This atlas focused on critical assessment of different crops, agricultural zones in the country for vulnerability to various climatic stresses and extreme events. As part of this process, NICRA helped prepare district level risk assessment of agriculture to climate change for 527 rural districts. And this risk assessment exercise helped to develop district level agriculture contingency plans, including key adaptation strategies for all the districts, and is being updated regularly. So based on the climate information and crop modeling outputs, suitable climate resilient technologies have been developed and tested on the farmer's field. So there are about 200 technological interventions that are identified and co-developed with farmers to suit various local conditions. That is a wonderful example in terms of how science has helped to devise methodologies to handle climate risks at the local level. And also there is in India, agriculture is a state subject. So unless, it percolates down to the state or district level, it has no use. So it's important. Also in the process, they've developed the research infrastructure as part of this process to systematically deliver and disseminate information on a regular basis. Weather forecasts and advisories provided by Met offices and the agriculture institutions currently kind of cater to about 40 million farmers in India. And that is really something. And with advance of technologies, there's been furthermore strengthened. And also it has collaborations across the board, both internally as externally as well. I'll just stop here. This is one of the key examples I thought where it made a difference. Thank you.
But yeah, that seems a really appropriate example. And of course, the situation of farmers in India has been in the headlines very much recently. So that's a very interesting and relevant example, I think. But for now, we'll leave it there and come back to you a bit later, because we do want to do one round again, everyone, after this, so that we can follow up on those examples by hearing about your recommendations as we go forward. For now, let's proceed and hear from Johanna Nalau. She's an adaptation scientist and actually one of the co-chairs of the World Adaptation Science Program. There's been quite a lot of critique recently on approaches that only rely on climate science, she's pointed out, and technological options, as these don't necessarily reflect the priorities and needs of those who should be adapting. This is what you've written to me, Johanna. So tell us about the examples that you want to bring.
All right, thanks so much, Veronica, and great to be on the panel. Yeah, I think my comment was in terms that we often have a bit of a deterministic point of view in terms of just if we only had more science and more precise science and models, then a lot of the options, a lot of the problems would be solved on the ground. And the same goes with technology options as well. So some of the really key decisions on adaptation don't necessarily even have to do with technology, but it's about understanding the decision-making context. So why are particular decisions made on the ground? What do those really mean for the communities? So one of the really interesting research projects that I've seen in the Pacific Islands has been by the Australian government, that has looked at Indigenous and local knowledge. So not just extreme events, but also, climatic indicators on the ground based on tradition knowledge. And so that project, COSPAG, has worked in Samoa, in Vanuatu, Niue and Fiji, and trying to connect the kind of climate science and with the meteorological departments and national services in those countries directly with communities. And so it's more of hybrid and knowledge base, really, that they're trying to create. And at the same time, increasing the awareness of climate change in the communities, but also really understanding, how those communities are perceiving change and how can some of the messaging be tailored so it is more useful for communities in their decision making. So I think that's an example that has really stuck with me, in the last few years.
Okay, and I wonder if you can bring some sort of color into it, because you're such a kind of distinguished scientist, and that seems like very abstract and technical to a lot of people. But what you're talking about, I really like the fact that you're talking about you're dealing with communities on the ground, and we all know how awful the situation is for islands, small islands in particular, in dealing with climate change. So I wonder if you can sort of tell a story that brings to life what you're talking about.
Well, I think, so some of the examples, for instance, in Vanuatu with the communities has been that there's particular weather-related indicators. So for instance, these have been traditionally used for disasters. So there's a particular bird. And so if that bird comes south enough and the communities see the bird, they know that there will be a cyclone approaching in a few months' time. And this is the knowledge that traditionally has been quite stable. And we are already seeing with this project and with other research done that that's actually also changing. So some of the Indigenous indicators are not actually valid because of the changing climate. So understanding that, and that brings a lot of instability as well for the communities if you can't rely on the knowledge that you have had generations. And across the islands, there's quite big concerns also that a lot of that knowledge is at the same time also eroding. And so a lot of the community-based adaptation in small islands in particular is trying to understand what is the Indigenous knowledge that can support robust climate adaptation, and where do we need to really kind of, integrate that with technological adaptation options and climate science as well.
Thanks very much. That really brings it to life. I can really see how that could be happening now. We'll get back to you a bit later, of course. Thank you very much for the time being. Now to introduce our next panelist, our next speaker, Dr. Pema Gyamcho is Director General of the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development. It would be really, I also want to mention that he's had a stint as one of the coordinating lead authors of the Kush Himalayan Assessment Report. That was a kind of mini IPCC for the Himalayan region involving 7 countries that was led by that organization. He also served as a member of the Indian delegation to COP meetings, contributing to the adaptation strand of the negotiations in the past. It's great to have you here, Doctor. And, we're dealing with very specific terrain here. The mountains have particular problems and challenges. Would you like to share with us any examples where science has played a role in forming policies?
Okay, thank you very much, Veronica. And just a minor correction. to your introduction of me, I am from Bhutan, and I represented Bhutan at the COP processes.
Oh, my apologies. Yes.
So, I'll speak on behalf of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. This region covers all the mountain areas from Afghanistan through to Myanmar, consisting of 8 countries. So in these are included, Pakistan, China, India, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Myanmar, and Afghanistan. So it's a huge region and a huge population. Now, this region, as you already mentioned, is very unique in the sense that it is often referred to as the third pole or the water towers of Asia. But important thing for us to remember is what happens in this region affects the livelihoods of over 1/3 of humanity, either living within the mountains or downstream from the mountains. So that is why this region is very, very important. Now, what do we know about this region? The International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, has carried out an extensive assessment of the impacts of climate change on the mountains themselves and on the people living there, as well as downstream areas. Now, from this assessment, we know that even a 1.5 degrees centigrade world will be too hot. 1/3 of our glaciers will disappear. And if you don't do anything, it will be worse. 2/3 of the ice bodies will disappear. And you can only imagine the consequences on the livelihoods, on the kind of disasters that would cause either within and downstream of the areas. So we also know that the water sources are drying up. More than 30% of the springs in Bhutan, Nepal, and the hill states of India have dried up already, and others are in the process of drying up. So this is causing increasing sort of a shortage of water for drinking as well as for food production and so on. We also know that the main causes of the ice melts are from pollutants from the factories in the adjacent areas and so on. So at the end of the day, what we know, the bottom line is that we know from this assessment enough to act now and not wait until it is too late. So what we have done is we got our 8 member countries to come together and agree on a set of 6 urgent actions that we need to take. One is to enhance regional cooperation. 2, act immediately on climate, the challenges of the climate change. So we had a ministerial summit last year, and the ministers have agreed to come together and take forward 6 urgent actions. Now, on the ground, what have we done? We have already started looking at how we can mitigate the carbon emission, the pollutant emission, and how we can adapt technologies. For example, the brick kilns in Nepal and Pakistan. We have over 1,000 brick kilns in Nepal, and around 414 have now adopted this new technology called zigzag technology. And using this technology, we can reduce the carbon emission by 60% and particular matter pollutants by 40%. So it's a huge impact. And over now 7,000 brick kilns have adopted this technology in Pakistan, and we are in the process of scaling it up. In terms of drying springs, we have also developed a protocol called the 6-step model for reviving drying springs, and this is also being taken up in many of our the countries and in the hilly regions. So these are just concrete examples, and at this stage I will stop here. Thank you very much, Veronica.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Pema. I'm going to ask you for your recommendations as well later, but for now, let's hear from our final panelist, Sir Robert Watson. He's a physical chemist specializing in atmospheric science issues and a leading authority on the science of climate change due to human activity, head of the Scientific Advisory Group and one of the lead authors of UNEP's 2021 synthesis report, Making Peace with Nature. His research on halogen and hydroxyl free radical reactions significantly informed models of how chlorofluorocarbons and other man-made chemicals deplete the Earth's ozone layer. And Dr. Watson's career spans research and advisory roles, including key roles with NASA, science policy advisor to US President Bill Clinton, and at the World Bank. the UK government. Bob was Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and he was chair of the IPCC from 1997 to 2002. Now, Sir Robert, that report, Making Peace with Nature, UNEP calls it the defining task of the 21st century. It offers a blueprint for a sustainable world that we need, with practical recommendations on how to tackle the three planetary crises of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. I wonder if you would please connect what we've been hearing today with the kind of big picture that you've been dealing with.
Well, first, thank you for inviting me. It's clear we need knowledge. We need knowledge from the natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, technologists, policymakers in general. The first point I'd like to make is the current pledges under the Paris Agreement are not putting us on a pathway of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. They're putting us on a pathway of 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. This will lead to very significant regional changes in precipitation, extreme weather, floods, droughts, heat waves, sea level rise, and we need good regional projections of how climate will change, and also what are the impacts of interannual variability, such as the El Nino effect. We also know there already are limitations to adaptation. Most human and natural systems have limitations to adapt to 1.5 degrees Celsius, let alone 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. Therefore, mitigation is absolutely essential. The slower the rate of climate change, the lower the magnitude of climate change, the more we can actually adapt, the easier it is and the cheaper it is. So mitigation is the best adaptation strategy. Given that climate change, biodiversity, land degradation, air and water pollution are all highly interconnected, we need to design strategies for climate and biodiversity that take these interconnections into account. And therefore you can have multiple benefits for climate, biodiversity, and for society at large, food and water security. Obviously, as we've heard, adaptation is very place-based and very context-specific, and therefore it must be enhanced by the complementary actions of many different actors, from individuals, private sector, governments, NGOs, and everybody. Now, the sustainability of a climate adaptation strategy is really enhanced, and we've heard this already, by the inclusion of local participation in the design of the projects and policies. And we need to make sure we take into account the visions and the values that local people have, especially Indigenous people and local communities. What are their values? Instrumental, relational, and of course intrinsic. They must be taken into account. What's their vision of the future? The nature-based solutions that we all talk about really have the potential to be win-win and have multiple benefits. However, not all nature-based solutions are win-win. There are some unintended consequences, and we must know about those before we start the project. Something that might be good for climate change mitigation or adaptation could be bad for biodiversity or food or water security. So we need a holistic view of how the system works. So what are the sort of things we need to do? We've almost heard a little bit about this. We need climate resilient agriculture. Agriculture that is temperature, drought, pest and salinity resistant. We need an agriculture that is biodiverse friendly, that actually looks after and protects pollinators and soil organic matter. If we do this, we can get food security. We need to actually restore and protect our coral reefs, our seagrass meadows, our coastal wetlands, beaches. This will help reduce coastal flooding and erosion. If we have green and blue spaces in cities, we can reduce urban flooding and heat-related risks, a good adaptation strategy. We need to protect and restore our floodplains, our peatlands, riparian vegetation. It reduces river flooding, another good example of adaptation. We need to restore degraded lands, especially our forests and our wetlands. This will both protect nature, sequester carbon, and therefore be a win-win for both adaptation and mitigation of climate and biodiversity and local livelihoods. And we need terrestrial, freshwater and marine protected areas. They can play a key role in both climate and biodiversity, but only if they're made climate resilient and only if they are well managed. Many are not climate resilient at the moment and many are not well managed. Lastly, my last point would be there are many national policies that actually increase our vulnerability to climate change. And therefore, the first starting point for me is we actually need to look at all policies. Are the policies making us resilient to climate change, or are they making us more vulnerable to climate? Many countries allow construction in floodplains and low-lying coastal areas. Very, very silly. They allow large withdrawals of groundwater, which actually gives you a subsidence that amplifies sea level rise. We have many subsidies that end up with a waste of energy, water. We need to get rid of those subsidies. And lastly, we need to make sure that all of these processes come together, and it's very, very doable, basically. The basic message is we need to look at all of these issues together. We need polycentric management. We need to make sure everybody's engaged in decision making. And to be honest, a sustainable future is viable. We need political will and we need trust between governments, with the private sector and with individuals.
It's such a privilege to have you here with your sort of the huge expanse of your expertise. So Bob, if I may, I just want to challenge you a little bit. You say it's very easy, but I mean, I look at all the governments and the way that everyone's really just struggling to deal with the pandemic and how to roll out vaccines and how difficult it's going to be for people to reach quote unquote herd immunity. It's not that easy. There are political problems here, and it might be something that scientists don't really sort of get.
No, what you're saying is there are vested interests. There's a lot of people that like cheap fossil fuel energy. Vested interests in the fossil fuel industry. There's a lot of people like subsidies in agriculture, in transportation, in energy. They want to keep those subsidies, but most of those subsidies are perverse. They don't help the poor person, and actually they actually lead to environmental degradation. What I'm saying is, with political will, with governments working with the private sector, the NGOs, international organizations, and the person on the ground, the marginalized, that we know what the technologies are, we know what the policies are, but there are vested interests that actually want the status quo. So we know what the solutions are, and you're absolutely right. There are people that don't want us to change, but we can change and we need to change.
Thanks very much indeed for the time being. Are you able to stay for another 15 minutes so we can loop
Sure.
back,
Yep.
circle back to you?
Sure.
Thanks very much. That's really great. Okay, we'll join Sir Bob again. That was such an interesting contribution that he made. But for now, I want to talk to the others and talk about these recommendations that they might make on the basis of their experience, bearing in mind that this networking event, APAN, is also serving to provide input to COP26 in Glasgow in November. Can we come back first to you, Ms. Willie?
Thank you so much. That's a really broad question that you've asked, and a really important one. I think I've really enjoyed hearing from fellow panelists who've already exposed some ideas and some of their thinking around this. So a couple of extra things to throw in, and I'll be brief in the interest of time. I suppose one of the things I would underline is the significance of an integrated science system. So we have the mechanisms and structures in place at all different levels to enable scientific advice to be collated and evaluated and brought into viable policy, so that we're really pulling through the full value of having great science by having the right systems in place that enable us to integrate science and research and policymakers and others who are responsible for action around climate. So systems would be my first point. Lots of people have already talked about engaging with communities, and I would underline that. I certainly agree with that, and the importance of social and behavioural science to enable people to adopt different practices and to be directly engaged in measures that are taken. The need for targeted communications and the way in which sharing between communities and between disciplines needs to be targeted for the people that we are focused on, and not to make the assumption that we are all speaking the same language, so to speak, but targeting our communications in a way that will have most resonance with the people to whom we are targeting them. And I would propose that, for example, we've looked at experience of citizens' assemblies in the UK, conducting samples of the UK population on their views, and have learned experience from that about how to share effectively and how to share information that is well positioned in the context of economic and social priorities. Otherwise, I think most of the points have already been touched on. Like others, I would underline the importance of working between the disciplines, really creating actively opportunities for integration between the disciplines and not taking anything for granted. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. Can I ask you very quickly, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, so please don't feel that I am. I'm just wondering, just because the UK is going to be the host for COP26, looking forward to that, I just wondered if you had anything to kind of inform us and the people attending this about what's coming up.
Well, we're greatly looking forward to hosting the Conference of the Parties later this year, but I suspect there are other UK speakers elsewhere in the programme who have spoken more eloquently about this than I can.
All right, thank you very much indeed. Sorry, I just wanted to take advantage of having you there.
Yes, we have other speakers elsewhere on the programme who participants may have heard from, I believe.
All right, thank you very much indeed. To Dr. Appadurai, would you like to put forward your thoughts as we go forward?
Yeah, no, it's kind of stating the obvious. Some of the points have already made, but it's worth reiterating some of those points which have been made. Good science leads to good policy, as you all know. So however, unless the messages emerging from the assessments and analysis are conveyed and communicated in a way that decision makers could relate to, it's not going anywhere. So it's important for us to, demystify science in a language they could relate to. That's a very critical point. That's where we kind of, we are making some advance, but still, not yet there, I feel. Secondly, the lack of quality data is a major challenge, as you all know. A lot needs to be done to systematize data generation, its upkeep, and creating access to the data. This is a fundamental for doing good science. And thirdly, we have plenty of good examples, particularly from this region and in Africa as well. These are very incremental nature, adaptation examples, I mean. It is time to think big. We should explore how science could help in building large-scale transformative adaptation. I mean, we are at that kind of a junction today, where we have experimented several ideas and nuances. We have understood certain nuances. So we have to take it to the next level, how science could help it in that process. That's a vital point. And also, as some others mentioned, particularly Joanna's work, as adaptation is a locally driven process, it is important to harness people's science and knowledge. And there is a repository of knowledge which is embedded in social and cultural systems. So this has to be integrated effectively into the modern science. That's a very important area to concentrate on. And adaptation is an iterative process, as we all know, as it needs sustained information flow. And science-led monitoring systems are also very important in this process. And finally, adaptation provides a unique space to link natural world with the human world. Science plays a very critical role in this link. That is why we need to consider social science in equal footing with physical sciences to make adaptation work. And particularly when you talk about social capital and the behavioral sciences aspect, it is a much neglected area. I mean, of course, research is going on, but still it has lots of importance to adaptation work. So I think it is important to highlight that and be a little more aggressive going about promoting this research. And finally, climate change urges humanity to a new culture of innovation, one that is guided by science and favors sustainability, as Bob said. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Appadurai.
Veronica, you're muted.
Excuse me, I'm muted. Sorry, I just noticed that. Over to you, Johanna Nalau.
All right. Thanks so much, Veronica. Well, I think there's you know, adaptation is becoming a mainstream topic across the world, and we're seeing how many journals are, you know, across all the disciplines are really starting to publish on adaptation. So I think there has been a recent shift as well in terms of also questioning some of the assumptions that we make about adaptation, that we make about decision-making or communities. And I feel like now we have so much knowledge already about adaptation. We still don't always know what actually works. And that's why my research is very much now focused on kind of questioning maybe some of the underlying assumptions as well, but also understanding the decision context. And so what are we creating or developing the science to? What are those decisions that, you know, need climate or adaptation science? And I'm being really impressed by some of the latest thinking, also on rethinking some of these kind of core concepts that we have, that we use all the time about adaptation, but also approaches where we try to create this kind of reflexive spaces where we can interact and actually listen to practitioners, listen to communities, actually asking better questions. Because, you know, all of the assumptions is often that when you have an adaptation project, these are the benefits, you know, this is what people need. And I think there is a really great opportunity also to kind of shift some of those tactics and actually listen. And I was very inspired by what Bob was saying as well in terms of having, you know, bringing everybody on board. And a lot of the things, yes, they are hard to achieve, and some might be easy. I think we have a collective opportunity really to progress adaptation.
Thank you so much. That's inspiring as well. Thank you very much, Hannah Nala. We'll come back and say goodbye to everyone. But for now, let's move on and ask for key recommendations from Dr. Pemo Gyamcho from his perspective. And having heard what everyone else has said, of course, as well, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Veronica, once again. And as I said earlier, I think we know enough to also act now. I think we should not wait for us to know everything and then wait for action. I think the action must take at the local level because as the other speakers already mentioned, the locals have enough indigenous knowledge and local knowledge to address some of the, you know, the key issues that they are facing related to, you know, adapting agriculture to changing weather patterns. For example, you know, there are indigenous crops that are resistant to drought and resistant to different climatic situations. So I think there is enough that we can act now, but action must take place at the local, national, regional, and global level. And one of the things that we need to know is the impacts of climate change do not stop at the borders. It doesn't recognize geopolitical boundaries. So regional cooperation, global cooperation is absolutely necessary. And particularly cooperation in research and information, data generation, and of course in exchange of this is very important. So without this happening, it would be very difficult for individual nations to address the impacts of climate change on their own. So at this stage, what we need is concerted effort to come together, work together, as Professor Boff has mentioned, and to go forward with on areas that we already agree upon and not wait for those areas that we don't agree or we disagree upon. So that is one thing. And at ICIMOD, we also take forward this river basin based approach. So we try to bring together upstream and downstream countries together to discuss issues, you know, such as flood related disasters. The flood waters don't stop at the borders. So unless we get the countries together, we will not be addressing the impacts of you know, the floods on people's lives. We also try to take up a landscape-based approach. You know, if you want to conserve biodiversity, it also requires trans-boundary cooperation, and a landscape approach is best suited for that purposes. Now, finally, I want to say that the Hindu Kush Himalayan region is the pulse of the planet. We like to refer it as the pulse of the planet. If the pulse is healthy, it is symptomatic that the planet is healthy. The Himalayas are visible from everywhere. I think it being the highest point on earth. If something goes wrong, then something must be wrong elsewhere also. So I would like to request all to recognize this aspect of the Hindu Kush Himalayan region. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for bringing that to our attention as well, Dr. Pema Gyantcho. And our final words to you, Sir Robert Watson. I really wanted to make the point, actually, that we should talk about the SDGs, because I know that the work that you've done has fed into the SDGs. And I wonder, I don't know what you were preparing to say, but I wonder if you could mention that.
Yeah, fine. Thank you very much. Well, first, we need to strengthen the science community, especially in developing countries and especially on the social science and humanities area. We need to learn how to use indigenous and local knowledge much better. But we need to reform our economic system. We need to recognize that GDP is a flawed concept. It measures economic growth, but not sustainable economic growth. So we need to complement GDP with natural capital and inclusive wealth. We need to internalize the externalities, social and environment, into the price of goods and services. Fossil fuels would be much more expensive if we internalize the external. We need to embrace a circular economy, get rid of a wasteful economy. Whatever we produce, we recycle. And we need to get rid of the perverse subsidies in fossil fuels, agriculture, transportation that impact both climate change and biodiversity. We need to reform our financing. Financial institutions can play a key role to make sure they fund low carbon economy, sustainable agriculture, sustainable transportation, sustainable cities. It's all plausible. But when we come to COP15 and COP26 on biodiversity and climate change, we need harmonized goals, targets, and even more important, actions. Goals and targets without actions are meaningless, to be quite honest. So and the basic point is, as I've tried to say, climate change and biodiversity interrelated. And your point, they all undermine the SDGs. If we don't deal with climate change and biodiversity, we will lose food security. We will lose water security. It will adversely affect human health. There are gender issues, equity issues, security issues. So the only chance we've got of meeting any of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals is to deal with climate change, deal with biodiversity, because they undermine every one of the other SDGs. It also means we need better governance at both the national and international level. We need all the UN agencies to work together. In an individual government, got to realize energy and agriculture and water are totally intertwined. We can't have separate ministries, or if we do, they've got to learn to work together and work with the financing minister. So clearly governance at both the national and international level is crucial. But the main point is when we get to COP15 and COP26, they must recognize we can't think of biodiversity and climate change as separable issues. They're highly interrelated, and they're highly interrelated with all of the SDGs. Therefore, we need harmonized targets, goals, policies, actions.
What a fantastic summation. Thank you very much indeed. I'm inspired. Hands up, I'm going to get on with it. Just want to give some key messages before we say goodbye. Just a reminder that our key messages from this session are that climate science has made immense inroads in understanding its causes and impacts. However, application of climate science in designing adaptation projects still suffer constraint by lack of climate data and assessment, specifically at local level planning. Also want to put out that resilience against adverse impacts of climate change cannot be built without integration of scientific assessment and understanding of impacts on natural, human and economic systems in national and sectoral development planning and financing and investing in adaptation actions. And that embedding robust scientific information and in decision-making across systems and to scale are incredibly important. Many thanks again to all the panelists and to all of you attending. Please give yourself a round of applause. And we're going to take a break. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for attending today's session as part of the 7th Asia-Pacific Climate Change Adaptation Forum. Please join us for the technical sessions beginning in 30 minutes, focusing on nature-based and inclusive resiliences. You can find the link to join these sessions by returning to the Sessions tab on the APAN Forum Conference Community on Hubolo. Within the community, you can also explore the exhibitions as well as chat or set up meetings with other conference attendees. Join the conversation on social media using the hashtag APAN 2020. And thank you once again for your participation, and see you all very soon and have a wonderful day.